I tried this last night on my living room floor, and my wife genuinely thought I'd fallen down. Giorgio J.J. Benítez spent decades insisting you can't reconstruct that night from a painting. You have to reconstruct it from the body, from the room, from what was physically possible in first-century Jerusalem. So I finally tested it myself. I propped myself on my left elbow, torso twisted, legs folded back, trying to bring food to my mouth with my right hand without spilling anything or sliding sideways. 5 minutes in that position, and my shoulder was already screaming. And here's the problem. That is exactly how the Last Supper happened. Not the way you're picturing it right now, with a long table, chairs lined up in a row, 13 men sitting shoulder to shoulder facing forward like a bank teller line. It makes sense to assume it looked that way. You grew up seeing that image on every church wall, in every illustrated Bible, in every cheap reproduction sold in a religious gift shop. Anyone would land on that same conclusion because it's the only version anyone ever showed you. I taught history for 12 years at a Catholic school in Indiana. And I taught that image too. I'd put Da Vinci's painting up on the screen, point to each apostle, explain who was sitting where, and never once stopped to ask whether it had happened that way physically. The posture, the table, the chairs. I accepted all of it as set dressing. The same way you accept the costumes in a historical movie without asking if the wardrobe is accurate. I remember the exact moment that cracked open for me. I was grading papers late one evening in the faculty room, and the school chaplain was going through a stack of old theology journals someone had donated to the library. He slid one across the table, opened to a footnote, and said, almost as a joke, "You know they didn't actually sit in chairs, right?" I laughed it off at first. Then I read the footnote myself. It cited period sources on first-century Judean dining customs, and none of it matched a single image I'd ever put in front of a classroom. I didn't bring it up with my students the next day. I told myself it was a minor detail, not worth derailing the lesson plan over. Looking back, that's the exact reflex the whole system depends on. Not lying to you outright, just training you to file the correction under minor detail and move on before you ask what else got filed the same way. Before I show you what actually happened in that room in Jerusalem, let me ask one quick thing. If this kind of reconstruction interests you, pulling apart the difference between what art taught us and what the documents and the archaeology actually support, it's worth subscribing now. YouTube only keeps showing me to people who signal they want more of this kind of investigation, and I promise the next layers get a lot more uncomfortable than this first one. You've probably never stopped to think about how the table looks in Da Vinci's painting. A straight line. 13 men on one side only, facing forward, like they're posing for a graduation photo. But think for a second about why. Da Vinci wasn't documenting a first-century dinner. He was painting a mural meant to be viewed from one side on a refectory wall in Milan, so the monks could see every face clearly while they ate. The composition served the painting, not the history. But if you step outside the frame of Renaissance art and go straight to the archaeology and the documented customs of the first century, the whole scene changes. There was no long table with chairs. There was a low, U-shaped table called a triclinium, a piece of furniture borrowed from Greek and Roman custom that the Jewish elite of the era had already adopted for formal and festive meals. And nobody sat. Everyone reclined, propped on their left elbow over cushions or mats, feet pointing outward from the U, eating with their right hand. Think about what that means for a second. One person's feet ended up close to the chest or back of whoever was reclining next to them. It was physically intimate, almost uncomfortable by our standards, and that's exactly the arrangement behind one of the most quoted details in John's Gospel. Someone reclining with their head practically against Jesus' chest. Modern translations soften this to sitting beside him, but the original text describes a physical closeness that only makes sense on a triclinium, never at a table with chairs. And here's the first real demolition. Once you swap the long table for the low U, the entire social geography of the scene changes. At a table with chairs, there's a fixed place of honor, a visible and permanent hierarchy. On a U-shaped triclinium, the position of honor is defined by proximity to the host, and that proximity could be rearranged at every single meal depending on who the host wanted to highlight that particular night. The supper wasn't a static photograph of fixed positions. It was an active statement made by Jesus about who he chose to draw close to himself that specific night. I got back up off my living room floor and just stood there for a second, rubbing my shoulder, thinking about how much of what I'd taught for a decade was staging, not substance. Not because anyone lied to me maliciously, because nobody in the pipeline that produced my textbooks, my slideshows, my Sunday school memories, had any reason to correct a detail that didn't threaten the theology. The posture didn't matter to the doctrine, so nobody bothered fixing it. That's worth sitting with, because it means the errors that do matter to the doctrine got a lot more careful handling than a detail about elbows and cushions. Hold on. That's still only the first layer. Because there's another detail Da Vinci's painting gets wrong, and this one is stranger once you sit with it. The little bread rolls on the table. Picture the painting again in your memory. Round, fluffy, clearly leavened rolls, exactly like something from a European bakery. But if this meal happened during or near the Jewish Passover, as the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, flatly state, then that bread could not have been leavened at all. Jewish law requires that during Passover week, all leaven be removed from the house. It's a commandment taken so seriously that families still today perform a ritual search through the home for any trace of leaven before the festival begins. So either the painting is wrong about the bread, or the Gospels are wrong about the date. And here's where it gets uncomfortable, because the answer is both, for different reasons. The second layer changes the frame completely because it isn't about a visual detail anymore. It's about a contradiction the Gospels themselves carry, one the Church has generally preferred never to explain in much detail on a Sunday morning. Matthew, Mark, and Luke state, fairly clearly, that the Last Supper was the Passover Seder, the ritual Jewish meal celebrating the Exodus from Egypt. But John's Gospel tells a different story. John says the religious leaders avoided entering the Roman governor's palace the morning after Jesus' arrest because stepping into a Gentile space would make them ritually impure, and they needed to stay pure so they could still eat the Passover, which according to John hadn't happened yet. If Passover hadn't occurred by the morning of the crucifixion, then the Last Supper cannot have been the Passover Seder. It had to have come before it. And that isn't a cosmetic difference between the Gospels. It's a calendar contradiction that changes the entire theological meaning of the meal. If it was Passover, the supper is about liberation, about the sacrificial lamb, about the Exodus from Egypt symbolically relived. If it wasn't Passover, if it was a covenant meal before the festival, as biblical historian James Tabor argues in depth, then the supper was something else entirely. It was what first-century Jews called a chabura, a fellowship meal among a group bound to each other by oath and shared purpose, typically held on a Wednesday or Thursday, not necessarily tied to the Passover calendar at all. I know exactly what a skeptic in the comments is going to say to this. The synoptics are three separate sources agreeing with each other, and you're throwing that out because of one line in John. Fair objection? Here's the actual answer, not a dismissal of it. Executing a prisoner on the single highest holy day of the Jewish calendar in the middle of the festival meal itself would have violated Jewish law and Roman political sense at the same time. Pilate had no interest in triggering a riot during the 1 week Jerusalem was packed with pilgrims, and tension was already at its highest. John's timeline, with the crucifixion happening before Passover begins, fits the actual political and legal mechanics of that week far better than a scenario where the authorities break their own holiest law to execute someone on the holiday itself. Three sources agreeing on the wrong week doesn't outweigh one source whose timeline actually survives contact with how first-century Jerusalem functioned under Roman occupation. Tabor goes further. He argues that the ritual of drinking wine as blood, the very foundation of the entire Catholic Eucharistic liturgy you probably grew up watching the priest repeat, could not have originated from within first-century Judaism the way the Church presents it. Drinking blood, even symbolically, is one of the oldest and most repeated prohibitions in Mosaic law. It appears in Leviticus with a clarity that leaves no room for double interpretation. A group of observant Jews, led by a Jewish rabbi, would hardly institute a symbolic blood-drinking ritual on the very night they were careful enough to strip every trace of leaven from the house. So where did the ritual that became the center of the Catholic Mass for 2,000 years actually come from? Tabor points to Paul, not one of the 12, someone who never met Jesus in the flesh, who had a vision years after the crucifixion and began preaching to Greek and Roman communities, already far removed from the original Jewish context. The Greco-Roman mystery religions of that era, the cults of Dionysus, for instance, already had rituals involving wine as a sacred substance of transformation. Robert Eisenman, another historian who spent decades studying the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Qumran community, connects the original meal to something even more rigid, an absolute covenant of commitment to Mosaic law practiced by Esseni sects living in the desert awaiting the end of days. Not a wine as blood ritual, a blood oath in the sense of total commitment, not literal consumption, which means the meal you picture, bread and wine as body and blood, a fixed ritual repeated identically in every Mass across the world for 2,000 years, may not be what happened in that room. It may be a later layer, added by someone who was never there, to serve an audience that didn't come from the Jewish tradition and didn't carry the same restrictions. I used to open my classes on the Reformation by telling students that Luther's whole fight was about scripture versus tradition. I never once connected that fight backward to the fact that the central ritual he was arguing about might itself already be a layer of tradition sitting on top of scripture, put there by a man who joined the movement after the fact and never sat at that table. Paul gets credited fairly with taking the message to the entire non-Jewish world, and without him, there may be no church at all in the shape you know it. But credit for spreading a message and credit for originating its exact ritual form are two different things, and the church has spent 2,000 years collapsing them into one. And here's where it gets truly uncomfortable, because it changes the question you should actually be asking. It's no longer, what happened at that table? It's, who decided what that table meant, and when? But before I take you to the core of all this, there's something that needs to be said, because it's the real emotional reason behind this entire investigation, and it has nothing to do with bread or posture. Who was actually in the room? The image you carry, 13 men, full stop, isn't just a matter of artistic composition. It's an editorial decision that erased real people. Luke's Gospel, chapter 8, verses 1 through 3, is explicit in a way most people have never heard mentioned in a sermon. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, wife of Chuza, Herod's household steward. And Susanna traveled with Jesus and financed the entire group out of their own resources. They weren't occasional visitors. They were a structural and financial part of the community's day-to-day movement, women with their own resources, political connections, and continuous presence in the daily life of the group. Think about what that means for the logistics of an intimate fellowship meal, a chabura, among people bound by oath and shared purpose. A group that ate together regularly, financed by these women, that included these women in daily life. And you expect that on one of the most significant nights in the entire narrative, they simply vanish from the room? That doesn't square with the very logic of the text that records their presence throughout the rest of the ministry. And Joanna specifically deserves a second look because her presence isn't a minor footnote. She was married to Chuza, who managed the household and finances of Herod Antipas, the very ruler who had John the Baptist executed and who later mocked Jesus during his trial. A woman with direct access to the inner financial workings of the Herodian court, choosing to fund and travel with an itinerant rabbi being watched by that same court, is not a background detail. It's a political fact with real risk attached to it, the kind of detail that gets quietly trimmed out of a story once the story starts being told to serve an institution instead of to record what actually happened. Go back for a second to that image you had in your head. The long table, the 13 men, the painting you've seen 1,000 times. Notice what it does without you realizing it. It doesn't just get the furniture wrong. It erases half the community that had been sustaining that movement for years. The painting isn't just historically inaccurate about furniture. It's a decision made 1,400 years after the event by a Florentine painter working for a duke about who deserved to be visible in the scene. And the erasure of women doesn't stop at a painter's composition. It has an entire chapter written down with a date, an author, and a documented motive. In 591 AD, Pope Gregory I delivered a homily, Homily 33, in which he merged 3 distinct female figures from the New Testament into a single person: Mary Magdalene, the unnamed sinful woman from Luke chapter 7, and Mary of Bethany. That fusion, made deliberately in an official church sermon, created the image that lasted 14 centuries: Mary Magdalene as a repentant prostitute. That was never in Scripture. None of the 4 Gospels calls Mary Magdalene a prostitute, a sexual sinner, or even connects her to the woman from chapter 7. It was an editorial decision by a pope, 6 centuries after the fact, that rewrote the identity of the first witness to the resurrection. The person the Gospels themselves describe as the first to see Jesus after the empty tomb, before even the 12 apostles did, turning her into a figure of sexual shame instead of spiritual authority. You were right to feel something was off about that story. You were just wrong about where to look for the mistake. It wasn't in your Sunday school memory. It was in the institutional decision that manufactured that memory for you, 6 centuries before you were born. And now, we reach what nobody talks about. The part that connects the table, the bread, and the erased women into a single explanation, one that goes far beyond details of historical set dressing. Because if you accept that there was a systematic erasure of who was in that room and of what that meal actually meant, the obvious question is, why would anyone bother doing that? An institution doesn't rewrite 6 centuries of collective memory by accident. It does that when it has something concrete to protect. In 318 AD, according to the account preserved by Catholic historian Malachi Martin in his book on the decline of the Roman Church, a group presented itself in Rome asking for an audience with Pope Sylvester I. That group called themselves the Desposyni, the Greek word meaning, literally, those who belong to the Lord. They were Jesus's own blood relatives, not spiritual followers, biological family, direct descendants of the line of Joseph and of the brothers of Jesus named in the New Testament itself. And here's the detail most people have never heard. This family isn't a modern invention or a bestseller conspiracy theory. Early church historians Sextus Julius Africanus, writing around 220 AD, and Hegesippus, both preserved in the records of Eusebius of Caesarea's ecclesiastical history from the early 4th century, independently document the existence of the Desposyni. They describe how this family maintained careful genealogies, led Judeo-Christian communities out of Nazareth and a town called Kokaba, and were, for generations, recognized as the legitimate line of authority within the original movement of Jesus's followers. Before that movement became what we know today as Roman Gentile Christianity. According to Martin's account, when the Desposyni arrived before Sylvester I, their request was direct, that leadership of the faith remain within Jesus's bloodline, centered in Jerusalem, the way it had been in the first decades after the crucifixion. Sylvester refused. The institutional decision he represented, backed politically by Emperor Constantine, who had just finished consolidating Christianity as a unifying force of the empire, was to keep authority centralized in Rome under a Gentile hierarchical structure, rather than under a Jewish family line based in a peripheral province of the empire. Think about the timing, because the timing is the whole story. 318 AD sits just 5 years after Constantine's Edict of Milan legalized Christianity across the empire, and only 7 years before the Council of Nicaea, where the Church would formally standardize doctrine under imperial sponsorship for the first time in its history. An empire that size does not hand its newly adopted state religion over to a small Jerusalem-based family with a genealogical claim and its own independent authority. It builds a structure it can administer from the capital, with a chain of command it controls, and it quietly closes the door on any rival claim to legitimacy, especially a claim made of blood, which can't be argued with the way doctrine can. The Desposyni weren't rejected because their claim was weak. They were rejected because their claim was inconvenient for an empire that had just finished building something it needed to keep. Hold on before you dismiss this as legend. The specific dialogue between the Desposyni and Sylvester, the way Malachi Martin narrates it, is a popularized reconstruction, and it's worth being honest about that. But the Desposyni themselves, the family's existence, their leadership in the earliest communities, the eventual institutional erasure as power migrated to Rome, that's documented independently, centuries before Martin wrote, by historians of the early church itself who had no reason at all to invent a rival family of authority. Eusebius, Hegesippus, and Julius Africanus weren't selling a book. They were recording, sometimes uncomfortably, a power struggle the church would have preferred to leave forgotten. And if part of you is still thinking this sounds like a modern invention dressed up as ancient history, sit with this. In 2002, archaeologists cataloged a 1st-century burial cave in East Talpiot, on the outskirts of Jerusalem, containing ossuaries, stone bone boxes, inscribed with names. Not one name, a cluster. Jesus, son of Joseph, Maria, Mariamne, Jose, and a Judah, son of Jesus. Every name on its own was common in 1st-century Judea, and skeptics are right to point that out. But statistician Andre Feuerberger ran the numbers on this specific cluster appearing together, by chance, in one family tomb, and calculated odds landing somewhere between 1 in 600 and 1 in 2,900. That is not proof. I want to be precise about that, because overstating evidence is exactly the kind of move that got the Gospel of Philip confused with a forged fragment a few years back, and I'm not interested in repeating that mistake here. But odds like that are not just common names either. They are a genuinely uncomfortable cluster sitting in a tomb outside Jerusalem, forcing the same question the Desposyni forced onto Sylvester's doorstep 1,700 years earlier. What if the family was never fictional, and the discomfort was never about evidence, but about what the evidence would cost the institution to admit? Now go back to that table. The Final Supper wasn't just a meal among friends bound by spiritual oath. It was the last documented moment when Jesus' own bloodline, his brothers, his close relatives, the women who financed and sustained the movement, were physically present and recognized as central to the story before centuries of institutional rewriting pushed them to the margins. The table was never about where people sat or reclined. It was about who had the right to keep telling that story once Jesus was no longer physically there to tell it himself. And the answer history records is that the family lost that struggle, century after century, until the biological kinship itself became a footnote almost nobody knows. This is the part nobody wants to hear on a Sunday morning. The faith you inherited wasn't just simplified by the distance of time. It was actively edited by people with names and dates and documented motives for power, and every edit pushed someone with a legitimate claim out of the scene. The women, the blood family, the actual physical posture of the meal itself. And if you're still holding on to the idea that at least the visual image survives intact, that at least Da Vinci's painting, even with the errors in posture and bread, is at least a genuine window into the artist's original intent, there's one last thing you need to know. Between 1977 and 1999, Italian restorer Pinin Brambilla Barcelon led a 22-year restoration of the wall where Da Vinci painted the Last Supper in the refectory of Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan. Layer by layer, she removed glue, wax, and overpaint, accumulated over 5 centuries, added by earlier restorers, well-meaning, trying to save a mural that had begun deteriorating, even in Da Vinci's own lifetime, because of an experimental technique he used instead of traditional fresco. What emerged shocked the art world. Far less of Da Vinci's original pigment survived than anyone had assumed. The pristine image burned into the world's imagination. The seated apostles, the tablecloth, the calm, symmetrical staging was, in large part, other artists' hands painting over Da Vinci's already fading intentions. The New York Times covered the revelation in 1999 under a headline that put it plainly: this was no longer entirely Da Vinci's Last Supper. Da Vinci himself is partly responsible for how badly the original faded. He wanted the flexibility of oil-based paint instead of true fresco, which has to be applied to wet plaster and finished fast, layer locked in for good within hours. He chose a slower, more experimental method, painting onto dry plaster the way he'd paint any panel, chasing the kind of subtle shading fresco can't achieve. It let him work at his own pace and rework details for years. It also meant the paint never bonded properly with the wall, and it started flaking within his own lifetime. By the 1560s, less than 70 years after he finished it, visitors were already describing a mural in visible decay. Everyone who has stood in that refectory since, admiring the original, has actually been looking at a 5-century relay race of restorers guessing at Da Vinci's intentions, one generation handing the guesswork to the next. Go back for a second to the very first sentence of this video. It makes sense to assume the Last Supper looked like Da Vinci's painting. Now you know that even the painting itself isn't what it claims to be. It isn't Da Vinci's original intent preserved intact across the centuries. It's a composite, a collage of multiple artists' intentions layered over 500 years in exactly the same way the story of the supper itself, the posture, the bread, who was at the table, who had the right to lead afterward, was composed layer over layer by people with their own motives, centuries after the original fact. It didn't take a conspiracy to prove that. It took a patient restorer with 22 years and a fine scalpel, revealing what was already there beneath the layers. This is in your life right now, even if you don't realize it yet. Every time you see a religious image that feels definitive, a painting, a statue, a phrase repeated so many times nobody questions it anymore, it's worth asking how many hands passed over it before it reached you, and what each of those hands needed the image to say to serve its own moment in history. Not to destroy your faith, to hand you back the right to ask, which is exactly the right the Desposyni lost in that room in Rome more than 1,700 years ago. Maybe you're sitting in a pew this Sunday, and the priest holds up the bread the same way he always does, and for the first time you find yourself thinking about a low table in a rented room instead of an altar. Maybe you're the parent explaining a Bible story picture book to your own kid at bedtime, and you catch yourself pausing before you point at Mary Magdalene's picture because you suddenly know that the label under her name was written by a man who never met her, 600 years after she died. That's not me asking you to walk out of church. That's what it looks like when a layer you didn't know was there quietly stops running in the background of your life. I still believe in the man at the center of that room. I just stopped believing every hand that touched the story afterward had his interests, or the truth's interests in mind. The version you inherited was convenient for whoever had the power to decide which version would survive. Before you go, let me ask one thing, because this comes from an honest place. I've spent years gathering sources like these: early church historians, documented restorations, calendar contradictions most sermons walk straight past. Because this kind of investigation doesn't pay the bills on its own, and videos like this one take a lot longer to research than anyone imagines watching the finished result. If this video made you question something you'd been carrying for years without realizing it, a super thanks is the most direct way to say that this kind of work deserves to keep existing. You're not just another viewer passing through. You're someone who decided it's worth knowing the difference between the convenient version and the real one, and that matters to me more than any view count. Tell me down below. Had you ever heard of the Desposyni before this video? Or is this the first time anyone's shown you that Jesus' own blood family had an entire chapter erased from the history you were taught? Write what you believed about the Last Supper before today, and what changed after this layer. I read every comment, and sometimes a comment is what leads me to the next investigation.